Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, Des Moines, Iowa, Diocese of Des Moines, also other dioceses, the center of it all. Iowa Catholic Radio Network, it's wonderful to have you on the show with us today. Whether you're listening through the airwaves, online at iowacatholicradio.com, on the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or some of our loyal, wonderful, beautiful podcast listeners, it is great to have you on the show. Bud and I here with you, where we work at Mercy College of Health Sciences. I'm the Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives and the Director for the Center for Human Flourishing. Bud, what do you do for Mercy?
On the radio show, I'm just going to start saying Academic Dean.
I like it.
The official title is Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences, but see, once I start into that, it's just hard not to trip up. There's a lot of hard consonants in there, so... Actually, there's not, but there's consonants.
You just want to make it as short as possible.
It's just a mouthful, but Academic Dean covers it mostly, and it sounds nice to me.
It sounds pleasant to the ear. Well, it is pleasant that Mercy College of Health Sciences underwrites our show, mchs.edu. Go check out what is on offer. We are in summer, but Bud, that means that fall is fast approaching, and even people who are considering maybe starting in the spring can go check it out, mchs.edu.
Yeah, no, this is a great time of year to check it out. It's the dog days of summer. I've been doing a little research on the dog days of summer. And so if you're feeling the dog days, I think, exploring a health sciences career is a great way to distract yourself from the insufferable heat.
I like that. It will keep you warm in the winter, cool in the summer, mchs.edu. Yeah, so I know that you've brought up the dog days of summer just in interactions otherwise, but you're going to call that, you've been researching it. It's been enough of a thing for you to dig into it, like a dog digging for a bone.
Well, and when you started back into it, I thought you were going to ask me to say more, and I forget what I researched. So I'm going to change the topic. When I was home last in Omaha recently for the 4th of July, I showed my dad the podcast. So I hope Dad's listening by podcast. Shout out.
Ward.
Yeah, because Saturdays and Sundays don't work as well for him for listening to the radio. But he said he would listen to the podcast. So that was kind of fun, introducing him to the podcast. One of the best welders in the greater Omaha metro area. But I introduced him to podcasting.
Was that the first podcast he's ever encountered?
I think, there's various ways to sort of encounter podcasts. So I know some of the big dogs they throw stuff up on YouTube.
Right. And
he maybe stumbled upon things that way. But he's like, is your show available when it's not on air? And that's where I was able to go to. Apple or iTunes, we're there.
Absolutely. That's what I was going to have you do, is say on air. So in case you're listening on the air and you'd like to listen at any time, you can go to anywhere that you access podcasts. And unless it's Russian, Black Ops site, I think you should be able to find us. But the easiest one, is if you go iTunes, you can just search The Uncommon Good.
I did an internet search, Uncommon Good Bonner podcast, and it brought it up pretty quickly.
You put me and not you?
Well, your name is unusual.
Do you know a lot of other Marrs?
I feel like with internet searches, you want to find the terms that are least likely to have other hits, and there's a lot of criminal Marrs.
Oh, wow.
That's not true.
Nice. The Bo Bonners that show up, when I remember when, I'm going to sound old, when I first started searching the internet for my own name, because that's what you did in the late 90s and early 2000s. There was a memorial to a dog named Bo Bonner that was a top hit above my name for a long time. I've surpassed that dog, and I don't know if it's just I've written enough or that it was on a GeoCities site or something, so maybe it went away. But that was my major competition for a while, was an obituary for a dog.
I kind of want to find a pun on, to circle back to the dog days of summer,
go.
but I'm struggling. The theme of the intro today is dogs.
Well, because what are we doing? We're doing the radio reading roundup with Augustine's Confessions, but we're only going to do one book, Book 7, because Book 7 is chocked full, and so a perfect thing to consider in the shade listening to the radio or on podcast during these dog days of summer as we dig into this tasty morsel of a book. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, as we were bringing up, we're talking about Augustine's Confessions because this is the radio reading roundup about his Confessions, Book 7. Now, Bud, in the intro to the show, you were talking about the dog days of summer. Real quick, tell the people the fruits of your research because it actually has something to do with what I want to bring up with Augustine.
Well, this time of year, Sirius, the brightest star in the Canis major constellation, rises before the sun. So the star would really stand out. In the ancient Romans, this time of year, like the July-ish era, they would call it the Dies Canicularis.
There you go. So,
I slaughtered that. The doggish days. I thought it was always because, like...
dogs were panting.
Yes, this time of year, dogs, they look really warm.
Yeah, and it was, I was pointing out to the kids that, like, this is where we biked around town all the time, and in Oklahoma, there were just always stray dogs trying to bite you. But the reason that this is actually relevant to Augustine is it's in chapter 7 where he points out that he definitively goes away from astrology. There's a lot of definitive going aways. He makes this point. He gets really into details about like a guy that was born the same day. He was he was the child of rich parents, and then the same day one of the servants or slaves in his quarters was born on the same day. So, like by scientific fact, they should have the same horoscope cast, but of course they live two completely different lives. And then he made the case about Jacob and Esau, that since they were born together, according to astrology, they should be the same. Yeah. So it's interesting that on one hand, I don't want people to dismiss the astrology stuff too soon. Yeah. On one hand, the ancients really did know far more about the stars just by walking out. To your point, but they noticed things like, Sirius is raising before the sun. That marks out the particular time in summer that it is. That sort of natural knowledge would come, sorry to use the word again, very naturally to a lot of people. So it would make a lot of sense to them, right, that the arrangement of the stars has something to do with time. I think we forget this sometimes, Bud. They're like, why is it so much that you go, if you were born under a certain star, you might be a certain way? But in the ancient world, the stars in the sky almost uniformly measured what was going on during the year. So all of the dog days of summer, when the dog star raised first, was going to make you think, oh, it's dry, or it's this, or it's that. So I don't think it's like completely just mystifying that people at that time thought that the arrangement of the stars, and that's where they get horoscopes. That's why the horoscopes are all named after constellations. Obviously, to them, it looked like, well, if the stars are a certain way, then the seasons are a certain way. Why wouldn't I be that way? But Augustine notes two things. On one hand, that scientifically this doesn't bear out. The twins make this point, or the master and the slave born at the same time. But one of the other things is he keeps pushing this idea, right, that people are going to find any way they can find to not blame themselves for what they do and act like someone else is doing it. And the will and the purpose of the will comes out shining in this chapter, even though a lot of people, and I don't know about your book, the book I read made it a big deal. It's like, oh, this is when he discovers Neoplatonism. Yeah. But it's true, but even that Neoplatonism is at the service of attending to this idea of humans will find any way possible to not accuse themselves, even the stars, rather than ask for forgiveness for what they themselves did.
Yeah, it's hard for us, I think, Bo, to enter into that mindset. You know, the pendulum has swung too far the other direction, where we have this really strong sense that we have control over our lives and over our destiny, like where our lives are going. So it's like, if I want to pursue this career path or be wealthy or whatever it happens to be, like I hold the keys in my hand to make this happen. And, you know, we can talk about fatalism and the idea that like our lives are sort of fated to be a certain way, or that the sort of role that we're born into will be the role that we die in. But it really is hard for us to like fully enter into that mentality and to understand what that fatalistic mindset would have been like. I mean, when you talk about the revolutionary nature of Christianity, I think part of it was just the idea that like God intervened at a certain point in history, and that history is going to reach a certain telos, that it has a definitive end and a good end. And so that's groundbreaking for St. Augustine. I don't think I think the responsibility piece is important, but certainly just like leaving behind the sort of superstition of the horoscope. That section of the book really spoke to me because I'm a twin and my brother and I are very different.
Right.
So I was like, yes.
So, and it's interesting that for ways in which people can both backtalk's not the right word, undermine Christianity as being anti-science, and Augustine himself gets pointed to as somehow being anti-science. Even in Christianity, it's like, oh, Thomas, who eventually gets back to Aristotle, that brings science back into the faith. This seems to me that this is an example of where he goes like, the evidence, right? He keeps talking about the evidence doesn't bear out this idea. And again, I think people act like the position of the astrologists at the time is far different than ours. So beyond the fact that like the kids these days seem to care about signs again, it seems like it's every other decade, like they cared in the 70s, they care again now. But what's interesting about this is people will act like, oh, this is just mystic mumbo jumbo. But like you said, it's more about a fatalism that they're like, well, obviously everything's arranged in a certain way. Yeah. So we'll get to the will in a second. We've been highlighting it a bit. But what's interesting is even all this way that Augustine has gone in his journey of thinking about God, at the beginning of Book 7, he points out there was still this sort of last stand that materialism was taking in his mind. And it's not that, again, people get this wrong, it's not that he was sort of too enamored with the mystic. For him, he had this really sort of silly understanding about if you're talking about God being everywhere and in everything, how is it that God is present to everything? So he says, I held the view, right, of this materialism because I was unable to think in any other way. But it was obviously false because he said, like, I started to imagine that you were God and you had this ethereal body, but that you must be in everything. And he goes, this starts to seem silly because that means an elephant is more God-like or divine simply because it's bigger than a sparrow. And he goes, you would be distributed piecemeal throughout the elements of the world, with greater parts of yourself present where there is plenty of room and smaller parts in more cramped space. Obviously, this is not the case. And then he goes on to say, his final opponents, like astrologists, yes, but even the Manichaeans, he goes, one of their big stories, right, was that the soul was part of the divinity that got mixed up with the material of the world. And that was like why the soul misses home but is evil. Yeah. And so he goes, their hearts were so evil and waxed full of malice, they were ready to claim that your substance was vulnerable to evil rather than they themselves that perpetuated it. So again, Augustine is actually looking at evidence and saying they're actually bending clear evidence in order to extricate themselves from the evil and the wrong that they do. It's not a matter of Augustine being like, oh, I need to be more spiritual. He's saying the accounts that they're giving don't hold up to just natural observation and demonstration about how things have to work if there is a spiritual reality.
Well, I know you want to get to the will. Before we move there, all that you just shared really sparked something for me. And I do think, so what I'm about to say, like, you can overstate this. So there's a certain kind of Christian apologetics that's sort of like anything good in the world comes from Christianity, and we just have to be careful. Like there is sort of like a circuitous path and kind of a mixed bag at times or whatnot. But I think what you were saying about the God who created everything and how God transcends his creation, but properly ordered it, like that really is foundational to the scientific worldview. If you're living with a mindset or a worldview that, like this kind of ontology of violence, if you read a lot of other like creation myths from the ancient Near East, they sort of see the world as being like, it came into being through some sort of act of violence, or like in some cases, a certain level of randomness. But, like the gods certainly don't have like a care for human beings. Like, in some cases they enslaved human beings, or, one god battled with another and then created the universe out of like its carcass or something like that, after slaying his opponent. But like with Christianity, you have this idea that like the God who created everything was motivated by love. It was a gratuitous act. And so for us to know God and then to learn about the world, they're under the same sort of umbrella. You know, Rene Girard, we've talked about him on the show. He gets into this a bit as well, where like we've talked on the show about this idea of like the intelligence of the victim, that in a lot of cultures that preceded Christianity, the victims were perceived as like, well, they must have done something to deserve their fate. With Jesus Christ, who exposes the scapegoat mechanism, you know, like he shows basically that not only are, you know, like not all victims are actually guilty, but like the ultimate victim, the one who like willingly went to his death, was God himself. Girard goes on to walk throughout a lot of points of later history and shows like, so like you look at something like the killing of witches during different points of Western history, and what ultimately sort of like caused people to question that was this idea like, well, if our Lord was an innocent victim, like maybe like these individuals are being scapegoated in a certain way as well. And Girard says like that really sparked scientific endeavors as well, because people started looking for like what today we call natural explanations for events that were previously perceived as inexplicable.
And all of that, I mean, I when you first start off, I was like, where's Bud going? I get it completely now. This is another way where considering evil and who's responsible leads to, like you said, a sort of scientific disposition that is inherent in Christianity. And it's like you said, it's not that Christianity has all the answers. It's Platonism, right? He's going to talk about the golden thread of paganism, and it's good here in a second. But another way that this happens, right, that he starts to look out and go, let's not just go with flat astrological explanations, or like you said, or superstitions, is there's a way in which you invent, you recognize yourself as a self that can be in error and can make corrections intellectually and amends with your will or with your morality. So, Bud, what I found very interesting is, I know people have said this multiple times, that Descartes, and so like again, the René Descartes looks like Descartes. He is considered the grandfather of modern philosophy. Very famously, people call it Descartes' cogito. It's the I think, therefore I am. And so this provides the epistemological turn. This is where modern philosophy became really obsessed with knowing and how we know things. And he famously does this by doubting everything else. But he goes, but I'm the one thinking about my doubts, so I must be existent. So, Bud, I found Augustine's version of that, because people have gone, well, Descartes just making a sort of new commentary on Augustine. A lot of people say Augustine in some way, the modern Western self as an individual starts with him. I think I found what they're talking about, and it's significant why it's different than Descartes. So my pagination, it's page 210. This is the relative beginning of book 7. But he's doubting, right? He's like, well, where am I and who am I? Where is God if God's not a substance, right? We've gotten used to Augustine sort of singing psalms of praise to God through asking big questions. And he gets to this one. When I wanted something or did not want it, I was absolutely certain that no one else but I was wanting or not wanting it. And then he goes, and I was beginning to perceive that the root of my sin lay there. But Bud, re-listen to this. When I wanted something or did not want it, I was absolutely certain that no one else but I was wanting or not wanting it. Now, he's pointing this out, saying against all these people who like blame the stars and everything else for why we want to do evil things and that evil is a substance. He goes, what's silly is when I really thought about what gets people into trouble, and it's wanting something that's good on its own, but wanting it in an improper way. We see where he's going with evil here. But he goes, when I had to stop and ask, who was the one wanting things? It was me. So that's like Descartes' cogito, I think, therefore I am. But for Augustine, it's I want, therefore I am. I know that I'm an existent thing because I know I want things, I desire things. Ultimately, right, he's going to talk about love and all things that are inferior to the love of God. But it's interesting, Bud, that's Augustine's version, so to speak, of a big philosophical claim that often gets brushed under the rug. But it's revolutionary for Augustine because he comes up with philosophical arguments because of it. God or even like the determinism the fatalism in his world can't be true, because even if my desires are elicited from somewhere else, or even if you want to say that they're implicit desires, like I'm born with some of them, Augustine goes, but I'm wanting them. It's me who wants them, and I either pursue them or not. I am the subject of my desires. But that's actually far more revolutionary than I think sometimes people might notice just by brushing up against it here in the Confessions.
Well, yeah, and in this case, like sometimes even in today's society, we think about materialism as sort of like a more like hard-headed form of rationalism. What I mean by that is like there are some critics of Christianity or faith who say like, well, if we just sort of like bracket any sort of explanation that requires spiritual beings or whatever, we'll get to the heart of reason or whatnot. And in Augustine's case, it was kind of materialism that was leading him astray. So, he continues to want to like think about God as an existent being, as having some sort of substance, even if that means like being spread throughout all of creation. But as long as he has that framework in his mind, it's really hard for him to make sense of evil. Like, whence does evil come from then? And is it an angel that God created? Well, if that's the case, like, it still in some ways is traced back to God. And that's where Augustine has this turn to the will, and he says, like, look, evil enters the world through, we've mentioned it on a previous episode, but through this like privation of the good. It's not a substance that you can somehow trace within the order of the universe. It's really like a lack or a want.
Yeah, and when he gets to the Platonists, and we're marching up to that, he really makes this certain. But before we go to the break here, what I found very interesting about Book 7 is multiple cases where more modern philosophers or thinkers already are like Augustine has already started to think what they're talking about. So we talk about Descartes. Well, this next one is so famously St. Anselm has a proof about God, that God is the greatest.
That than which nothing greater can be thought.
Correct. Now listen to Augustine here. So this is just a few pages. It's on the same page, actually, as the quote I made earlier about the I will, therefore I am. My efforts were directed towards discovering more of the truth on the basis of the discovery already made that what is indestructible is better than anything liable to be destroyed. And so on that one, folks, that's going to lead him to Platonism. He's like, look, if you have something that can never go away, it has to be something better than something that could. Now this, accordingly, I confess that whatever you might be, you must be indestructible. No intelligence has ever conceived of anything better than you, or ever will, for you are the supreme and all-surpassing good. But that's just Anselm's proof already. Yeah. Like 1,000 years before he came up with it, 700. But since the indestructible is most truly and certainly to be esteemed above what is destructible, as I already knew, it followed that you must be indestructible, because otherwise my mind would have been able to attain something better than my God. So, but if we're keeping track at home, he predated Descartes, but put the twist that it's the will that makes us know that we're a self rather than our thoughts. He predated Anselm, but instead of just saying like an abstract proof, and Anselm was doing something completely different, his point is to say, look, if you can imagine something better than another quality, it belongs to God. And so in this case, he goes, indestructibility is better than destructibility, so I know that must be you. So, Bud, this is going to lead him out of thinking that God is a substance, right? Because spirit, as understood by the Neoplatonists, is not only indestructible, but incorruptible, right? Matter corrupts because it falls apart, but the spirit never can. All of these first of all, just very interesting that Augustine sort of predating a lot of Western philosophical discoveries, but he's using it, showing us how in thinking, not always about thinking itself, sometimes about the will, sometimes about God, but in thinking he's walking closer towards that conception that has evaded him all this time.
Yeah, I wrote the same thing in my margins about predating Anselm, and now I'm curious. I want to go back and look at some of the history of this, and I wonder, so like when Thomas Aquinas talks about Aristotle, he just writes the philosopher. Yeah. I think when he talks about St. Augustine, he just writes the theologian. Like, It's obvious to everyone, you're like, MJ's the GOAT.
Not LeBron. Yes.
Shots fired, John Leonetti.
Don Scotus people are people saying LeBron.
Yeah,
they're the LeBron
right.
people, aren't they? Because that's anyway. Sorry,
but it shows like Saint Augustine saying that, or Saint Thomas referring to Augustine as the theologian, shows you how much of an authoritative source he was in the Middle Ages. So I mean, I'm going to throw it out on the airwaves right now. I'm guessing that Anselm's argument is rooted in this passage, that maybe sparked his mind.
Yeah, and I mean, so Thomas famously goes, right, that God's essence is its existence and vice versa. Yeah. Augustine has something like this too, for God's will and God's power are identical with God himself. So he even has an FDR one. Remember, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. So either the evil we fear exists or our fear itself is the evil. So a man ahead of his time. This is The Uncommon Good. We'll be back with Augustine right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show, Radio Reading Roundup, Augustine's Confessions, Book 7. Bud, still so much more to talk about, so let's get going. Bud, very famously, people make a huge deal about this in grad school and whatever, that Augustine reads the Neoplatonists, and it really is a game changer. So before I go on saying in ways that this time around, I'm sort of impressed about how much he has to say against the Platonists. But for you, do you recall the first time running into this, I mean, either this section or people talking about Platonism's impact on Augustine, and how did that move your way of thinking about God differently, for instance?
Well, I'll be honest, the first time I was kind of exposed to this philosophy, I did get a caricature of Aristotelianism versus Platonism, although in some ways it's proved helpful, like as a reference point. So, like Aristotle and his followers, they sort of like they're resistant to this idea of forms that exist apart from actual entities in the world. So like they classified things according to like, there's not an ideal sort of like dogness. There's individual dogs, and we sort of extrapolate from our encounters with things in the world, sort of like framework for understanding everything. But yeah, so with Platonism, like there's a contrast there where there's an ideal world of the forms through like according to which like things in the world participate in. So again, with something like there's a form like chairness, and we can recognize a chair because it participates in that form. This is all, it's huge for Augustine in the sense that he uses this entire philosophical system to begin to understand God as spirit. God is immutable, though having created everything, like it really is just like a spark for an important path for him.
Yeah, okay, so this precisely hits on a very dorky part that I hope people listening will forgive me. He never mentions the forms.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. I mean, you've admitted this, that there's these characters about Aristotle versus Plato, and even if you go read at the time, I think there's a lot more nuance. At the time, people didn't think they were as radically separate as maybe the shorthand Western history intro class makes it. What's interesting for me, though, is Augustine, he'll go into what he thinks the Platonists don't get correct. But for me, and you tell me if you get the different impression, for him, the revelation was that you could talk about entities being spirits, and that truly meant that you shouldn't think of them as having material extension in any way.
Yeah.
So a spirit is... So what I mean by this is Platonism for him seems to be the key that allows him to think about things as... I mean, to use a dorky word, apophatically. So what he's getting at is like, there's perfections, right? So this is where the pre-Anselm stuff comes from. Yeah. There's perfections, and then the lack of those perfections that are sort of a continuum, right? So if God is immutable and indestructible, then there's sort of a ladder down from that about more and more destructibility. But what he's going to land on is to say, what I get from the Platonist is anything that exists can't be completely evil, because to exist itself is good. And so why that seems to radically reorient him is to say existence doesn't need like God as an ethereal substance within it to have some good, or otherwise it will just be corrupted by this demiurge or other god. He goes, look, insofar as anything exists, again predating Thomas saying similar things, existence itself is good. So evil doesn't have to exist. It just needs to be the lack of the fullness of existing. So less than like forms and some of the stuff you really hear with Plato, it really seemed like that was the big key for him, to understand the spiritual world as perfected And then you start to think about the material world as not as like wrong or evil or an alternate God, but just not completely the perfection that the spiritual world is.
Well, and with his theories about time, and then also what you were just saying about God, like being spirit and not having extension. For myself, I think back to my early years studying philosophy, and it's kind of funny to think now, but it really is hard, I think, sometimes when you're younger in the faith to get over the idea of God as just like a super being. So we think of God as very similar to us. God just has more power, but like later Christians build on Augustine's thought to say like, God is not part of the furniture of the universe. It's not that God exists within the universe and then just has like, like I said, he's more powerful or more knowing than us. God transcends everything. That's really hard for us to conceptualize or wrap our minds around, but this is huge for Augustine. And then that leads to a correlative point that like these characteristics that we ascribe to God, they're not even properly understood as characteristics. It's not that God is good in the same way that we're good. Like God has certain personality traits that we ascribe goodness to. God is goodness itself. And so all of creation participates in that goodness at some level. Like you were saying, even by existing, the most heinous criminal that we can think of, it's not that goodness has been completely obliterated in them. There's still like we might say a spark of goodness as a sort of metaphor, but like in their very existence, there's goodness there. And that's why as Christians, like part of the reason I think why we confess, like even those who turned away from God in abominable ways, they're not annihilated. Like their continued existence is a good. But beyond that, like all of us are either moving towards God or away from God. And insofar as we're moving away from God, we're not attaining more freedom. We're actually being corrupted. Like sin is a sort of cancer that eats away at our being. It doesn't expand who we are.
Right, because we're not going towards anything. It's like actually closing possibilities. Yeah. I think this is interesting because, so he has these wonderful 2 lines, well, actually 3 that I want to read. And it's about how because he's gone on in periodic ways, like praise the Platonists, and then he'll say things like, oh, but what they never talk about is the crucified one. So he makes this, they don't understand kenosis or pouring yourself out like the Lord. All interesting. But then he lands on why it's important to think about the Gentiles, and he gets into the sort of what becomes the patristic. The fathers really harp on this, right? The plundering of Egyptian gold, that if there's something good in the world, we can make it, put it to use for, God. So he goes, it was pleasing in your sight, Lord, to take away from Jacob the shame of his subordination and cause the elder to serve the younger. So you called the Gentiles into your inheritance. So at that part, it's interesting that he brings this up at the same time he's going to say he first reads Paul. So he's already going like, God likes using the later, the younger, the not chosen for the sake of correcting something about the chosen. Then he says, and I had come to you from the Gentiles. I set my heart apart upon the gold, which at your bidding your people had brought out of Egypt, because wherever it was, it belonged to you. So you told the Athenians through your apostle that in you we live and move and have our being, and indeed that some of their own authorities had said this, so Paul again, and unquestionably those books I read come from there. But what I'm thinking, because I've been harping on this, Augustine seems to always in the background is making a comparison between learning to read better and getting deeper in the faith. And this sort of allegorical reality of how we read is also the allegorical reality of our lives. So what I'm saying here is it seems like what he's saying is God has allowed the Platonists as Gentiles, the younger brothers, to correct what often happens to some Christians when reading the scriptures, namely him, right? He said that, and he said it multiple times, I read the Old Testament, and it didn't seem as good as Cicero, and I read it extremely literally. And what did that literalism lead to, bud? Materialism. Mm-hmm. So Plato, as the younger brother Gentile, using the pagan Egyptian gold to purify the religion of Abraham, I misunderstood. Saying Augustine, I kept imagining you needing to be like a person with substance, even if it was diffuse throughout the world. And the Platonist helped me realize that this was an insufficient way to understand who you were. That gets to your point exactly what you're saying is now my eyes can be open to start to understand two of the things that have hobbled me so far. One, says Augustine, the materialism that vanquished, vapored away when I started to understand truly about spiritual realities. But then the second one is evil, which I thought had to be a thing. And so I had to think of it as opposing, but now I realize it is simply the lack of the good. And all that actually exists proper is God and his goodness, but we sometimes have a lack of that and even choose that lack.
Well, this whole part of Book 7 leads to a really profound reflection on the incarnation.
Yes.
And there's a lot of different angles at which we could approach, like why God became man. We've already thrown out Anselm's name, and one of his most famous writings, Cur Deus Homo, is it's an entire reflection on why God came and dwelt among us in the flesh. For Anselm, Christ our Lord had to be human because it was humans who had committed an offense against God. And yet if it was just any human, like Bud Marr is incapable of providing the atonement that's necessary because I'm burdened myself by sin. And so he has this whole reflection on it. St. Thomas Aquinas says some wonderful things about how the incarnation was fitting. For Augustine, and I think this ties back to his Neoplatonism, it's important that the Word was made flesh because the Word is a mediator between God and his essence and human beings. So if you think about all that we're saying about who God is and how, like later medieval theologians will say, anything that we ascribe to God, whatever like positive statement is there, God is still more dissimilar to what we have said than we've captured in the content of what's been said. And so like, again, like that's tough for us to think about. Like we don't in this world have a being among us who goodness is not a characteristic, but that person is goodness itself. And so this leads Augustine to begin thinking about, like, if that's the case, how could human beings, not only simply on the basis of being sinful, but also our finitude, like there seems to be almost an infinite chasm between us and God, but the Word made flesh is the linchpin, and the Word, it truly like gives us a glimpse or like a reflection of who God the Father is.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about him all the time, and but another modern thinker that I said Augustine was already preempting was Marshall McLuhan, the famous "The Medium is the Message" guy, precisely with Christ as mediator. So he says, accordingly, I looked for a way to gain the strength I needed to enjoy you, but I did not find it until I embraced the mediator between God and humankind, the man Christ Jesus, who also is God supreme over all things and blessed forever. And so he makes this point that he wasn't humble enough yet to grasp Jesus, which is why he could like take stabs at getting closer through things like the Neoplatonist, but was always missing. Your Word, the eternal truth, who towers above, the higher spheres of your creation, raises up to himself those creatures who bow before him, but in these lower regions he has built himself a humble dwelling from our clay, and used it to cast down from their pretentious selves those who do not bow before him, and make a bridge to bring themselves to him. And then one more on this note. Indeed, the discrediting of heretics serves to throw into high relief the mind of your church and the content of sound doctrine, for it was necessary for heresies to emerge in order to show up the people of sound faith among the weak. Even the mistakes of the heretics is this way of humbling even the church itself, so that it will become a pliable, so it will build a bridge to the mediator between the unspeakable God, like you were pointing to.
Yeah, his mind is so agile because once he says what he does about Christ as mediator, he then turns immediately to misunderstandings of that. And he had a friend who said, well, yes, the Son of God came in the flesh, but he didn't take on a rational mind, or, how's he say it here? Alypius thought that Catholics believed God to be clothed in flesh in such a way that there was in Christ nothing else but Godhead and flesh. He did not think they're preaching assigned to Christ a human soul or a human consciousness. And so like in the early church, you have those who, as these debates about the incarnation are going on, they sort of try to like protect the Godhead. They don't want Jesus to be too human. And later, you've got the great figure like Athanasius who says, like, what God has not assumed, he has not redeemed. And so Christ had to assume all of human nature so that all of human nature could be redeemed. And that's where Augustine says, like, even the heresies shed light on the truth of God. In this way, he's really predating or foreshadowing the work of St. John Henry Newman. And again, I'm curious, like, if Newman first started thinking about this by reading the Confessions, but like Augustine,
Book 7 alone.
There's these time bombs there that just go off in later Christian history. And Augustine, like, he's got such a profound conceptualization of providence. Like, thanks be to God, like, even the heretics bring into sharp relief the truth of God's revealed word.
And I think this is one more way that the Platonic influence is not like the cookie cutter, what you read in like a manual about Western philosophy and the sort of, the Platonic forms and stuff. It starts to be what he ran into in the sort of spirit and comportment towards questions that he imbibes that ricochet throughout all of Western theology. So again, Bud, this thing with heretics, it's not that there's two opposing factions, which he thought at first, the good and the evil, and you have to separate them out. Heretics are just people who have forgotten what God is truly like and what Christ and his apostles have said. And this idea of forgetting starts to be really important. And if you think about it, Augustine is the most Socratic, so it's like Socrates, teacher of Plato. He's the most Socratic when he hints at, I forgot who I was, I went away from where I was. Boethius famously, sort of, for Christians, puts the definitive point on this, that sinning is to forget who you were and where you belong. But he already starts to say this when he's talking about the Platonic ecstasy that he goes into but sort of falters in. He goes, warned by these writings that I must return to myself, I entered under your guidance, the innermost places of my being. So, Bud, one more time, Descartes is like, well, if you doubt everything, you'll notice that you're thinking, and that's what you can be sure of. Augustine, by saying, I know I'm the one who's willing, so I need to turn into myself. And when I return to myself and I enter that innermost place of my being, I'll start to realize why those desires are frustrated. Mm-hmm. Once he does all this, he's like, I entered then with the vision of my spirit, such as it was, and I saw the incommunicable light far above my spiritual, transcending my mind. And I have like 4 quotes that I would read, so I'm not going to. Yeah. But what he gets at right is that what he says is it's not that God was above him, like, being is a bunch of water and there's oil that floats in the top, and that's God. He said, I realize that God is like the sunlight completely out of the ocean. And it penetrates its rays on everything, but it's not a part of us. But because of it's outside of itself, all of this can exist. And that's what really starts bringing him away from these deep-seated difficulties that are going to lead into Book 8, where he converts.
Yeah, and the end of Book 7 is really moving. I feel like I've kind of landed on this idea at the end of each episode where we've talked about Augustine. But after all of this, just amazing, brilliant, speculative philosophy, he then turns near the end of the book and says, but there's still a way that the pagan scholars, no matter how smart they are, maybe because of their smartness, that they get it wrong. Because he says you can't find within their pages the lineaments of loving kindness, or the tears of confession, or the sacrifice of an anguished spirit. Like, in some ways, pride enters the picture, and it keeps them from totally approaching God because they're sort of scandalized by a God who is humble and who approaches us with gentleness and kindness of heart. And that's where Augustine, like, I don't know, maybe you had a different interpretation of the ending of this book, but he says, like, basically, I had made all these moves in my mind, but there was still one thing missing. Yes. There was the act of the will. So he says, it's one thing to survey our peaceful homeland, and this could be a beautiful prayer for your week. So it's one thing to survey it from a wooded height, but fail to find the way there, and make vain attempts to travel through impassable terrain. This is far different, or another thing entirely, to walk steadily in the way that leads home along the well-built road opened up by the heavenly emperor, where no deserters from the celestial army dare commit robbery, for they avoid that way like torment. And so he says, like, to walk this path, to actually take God at his word and take the next step in trust, like this is what Book 8 is about, I think.
Yeah, and I think that puts such a different take on where he talks about evil. Augustine so often gets like tagged as the guy who like loves hell and fire and brimstone, and I'll be honest, later in his life he probably earns the stereotype. But here, Bud, even his idea about like evil has no proper existence is already a step towards this Christian kindness, right? Everything that exists is good, he says. And so evil, the source of which I was seeking, cannot be a substance, because if it were, it would be good. And so he goes, for you, God, evil has no being at all. And this is true not of yourself only, but of everything that you've created. So he goes, in some parts of it, certain things are regarded as evil because they do not suit certain others, but these same things do fit in elsewhere. And so finally, to land a little bit on this, because we're already past. No longer was I hankering for any elements to be better than they were, because I was now keeping the totality in view. And though I certainly esteem the higher creatures above the lower, a more wholesome judgment showed me that the totality was better than the higher things on their own would have been. What a journey, someone who thought half of the world was diametrically opposed to the good element, that he could see it that way. And you're right, it's that preparation that leads up to that final moment of the will to follow Christ on the cross. And that's what we'll get to be able to see in Book 8, which we'll get to do next week. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back for the final segment right after this. Back to The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, this is where we always wrap things up. But before we get into the sort of weekly things, one big absolute shout out to our brother, Jimmy. He's been with us, I don't even know at this point now, it seems like, let's just say 20 years, Bud. That can't be true, but it seems like 2 decades. He has been marvelous in helping us make the show. We have very strange schedules. He has been more than happy to edit and splice things together. We're going to miss him a lot. He's going on to wonderful things, working downtown with the Des Moines Commerce Chamber, right? Chamber, excuse me. And we just want to say thank you to Jimmy, and God bless, Godspeed with everything, and really thank you for everything you've done, not only for Iowa Catholic Radio, but specifically The Uncommon Good. We'll miss you, brother.
No, I would echo that, Bo. And, Jimmy was not on air during our show a ton. Like, he would jump in from behind the glass, like, rarely.
Right.
But they were shining moments. I think if we compiled, like, a greatest hits, Jimmy would show up in several of them, just so. It was like, what's it called? Like, quality over quantity.
That's right.
Like, the Jimmy moments were distilled down, but they were classic.
One shining moment, but for Jimmy, I like it.
A reminder about our prayer life. And so this... I'm not going to give you like Powerball numbers, but grab a paper and a pen and write this down. These are just as important. 6, 10, 2, 55.
Which one's the red balls?
6, 10, 2, 55. So we pray the rosary on air at 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. Later in the afternoon, the Chaplet of Divine Mercy at 2:55 p.m. You can also jump on the Iowa Catholic Radio app anytime, anywhere to pray the rosary. And
if you want to be involved in Iowa Catholic Radio events, you can go on iowacatholicradio.com and click events and see what's going on. A few coming up, July 19th, 2023 in the Tea Room, Core Night with Dr. John Bishop. Topic, Your Job in the Trinity, Why Work is a Holy Thing. July 22nd at St. Pius X in Urbandale, 8th Annual Ignatian Treat with Amy Hoover. July 27th through 29th in Minneapolis, they got the 42nd Annual Chesterton Conference. And then, of course, when August starts rolling around, Bud, Iowa State Fair things. Make sure to check that out about all of the various bands and whatnot playing. And then, Bud, just to look further into the future, of course, December 8th, always a big date here with Iowa Catholic Radio. Embassy Suites downtown, dinner in December with David Anders. Again, iowacatholicradio.com to check out the events. Bud, the last thing that we always say to people, this ministry is not possible without you. It's not just us folks on the air, the good people behind the boards, even when it's great people like Jimmy, who we'll miss, the people behind the desk. It is your ministry as well. It does not work without your time, talent, and treasure. We covet your prayers, your volunteering, but specifically, we always have to make appeal. Please, if you have it, the capacity to do so, donate to Iowa Catholic Radio so we can continue this ministry and allow the words of Jesus to break down walls, broadcast throughout Iowa Catholic Radio and on the World Wide Web. Thank you for all of you who donate. 515-223-1150 or iowacatholicradio.com or the Iowa Catholic Radio app to donate. Thank you very much. Bud, have a wonderful week.
Yeah, blessings and prayers. Thanks, Bo.
This is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, our family, city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good, and we will be back next week. See you later, folks.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for the Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.